Molly Chang's life had once been filled with laughter, love, and the innocent joy of raising her 3 young children. Her husband, Yi Lee, was the quiet strength of their small family in Maplewood, Minnesota. They had built a life together, grounded in their shared Hmong heritage and the deep connection they felt with each other. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, a secret began to fester, a secret that would lead to a tragedy no one could have foreseen. Yi had always been a reserved man, prone to keeping his emotions buried. But recently, something had changed. He became distant, his eyes clouded with suspicion and pain. He had heard rumors, whispers that his wife, Molly, had been unfaithful. At first, he dismissed them, trusting in the love they had built together. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over time, it grew into something dark and uncontrollable. One evening, Yi confronted Molly. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Molly, caught off guard and overwhelmed with guilt, couldn't deny the truth. She had made a mistake, one that she deeply regretted, but it was too late. The damage was done. Yi, unable to bear the betrayal, spiraled into despair. That night, in the quiet of their home, he made a tragic decision. He took his own life, believing that death was the only escape from the pain. The next morning, Molly found him. The sight of her husband's lifeless body shattered her. The weight of what she had done, the guilt of her infidelity, was too much to bear. She was consumed by shame, not only for betraying Yi but for the dishonor she had brought upon her family. In her grief, she felt that there was no way forward, no way to face her children, her family, or the community that had once held her in such high regard. As the hours passed, Molly's despair deepened. The once clear boundaries between right and wrong, life and death, began to blur. She couldn't imagine a life without Yi, and the thought of living with the shame of her actions was unbearable. In her distorted state of mind, she convinced herself that the only way to make amends, to find peace, was to take her children and join Yi in death. She gathered her 3 children, Quadrillion, Phoenix, and Estella, and drove to Vadnais Lake. The park was a place they had once visited as a family, a place filled with happier memories. But now, it was nothing more than a cold, dark mirror of the despair that had taken hold of her soul. As they approached the water, Molly's heart pounded in her chest. The voices in her mind, fueled by guilt and shame, told her that this was the only way, that by taking her children with her, she could protect them from the harsh judgment of the world. She led them to the water's edge, their small hands clasped in hers, and one by one, she held them close as she smothered their cries, silencing their young lives before wading into the depths of the lake herself. By the time authorities arrived, it was too late. The search for the family was grim, the stillness of the lake betraying nothing of the horror that had unfolded beneath its surface. One by one, the bodies were pulled from the water, first little Quadrillion, then Phoenix, followed by Molly herself. Estella, the youngest, was found shortly after, her tiny body cradled by the dark waters. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community. The sheriff's office ruled the deaths a triple murder-suicide, the result of a mother's overwhelming grief and guilt. Yi's death, the catalyst for it all, was ruled a suicide, a tragic consequence of a love betrayed and a heart broken. In the weeks that followed, the town struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Whispers of infidelity and shame spread, but no one could truly understand the depths of despair that had driven Molly to such a horrific act. The lake, once a place of serenity, became a haunting reminder of the darkness that can fester in the human soul. And for those who knew the Lee family, the memory of their smiling faces would forever be tinged with sorrow, a ghostly echo of lives lost to the unforgiving waters of Vadnais Lake. A few months after the tragedy at Vadnais Lake, a heavy stillness settled over the water. The once popular spot for fishing and quiet reflection became a place of eerie silence, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. The townspeople of Maplewood tried to move on, to push the horrific events from their minds, but something lingered, a darkness that seemed to seep into the very air around the lake. It started with the fishermen. Those who ventured to the lake in the early morning or late at night began to report strange occurrences. At first, it was just a feeling, an inexplicable sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as they cast their lines into the murky water. But soon, the unease gave way to something more tangible, something that could not be easily explained away. One foggy morning, just before dawn, an old man named Harold was the first to see them. He had been fishing at Vadnais Lake for decades, knew every ripple and current, every spot where the fish were likely to bite. But that morning, as he sat quietly in his boat, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just the mist playing tricks on him, a shadow moving just beneath the surface of the water. But as he leaned closer, the shadow took shape. There, just a few feet from his boat, were the faces of children, pale and ghostly, their eyes wide with sorrow. Quadrillion, Phoenix, and Estella, recognizable even in death. Their tiny hands reached out toward the surface, as if trying to grasp at the world they had left behind. And behind them, barely visible in the fog, was the figure of a young woman, her long hair floating around her like seaweed, her face a mask of grief. It was Molly. Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. But before he could react, the figures vanished, dissolving into the mist as if they had never been there at all. Shaken, he pulled up his line and rowed back to shore as quickly as he could, vowing never to return to that cursed lake. But Harold was not the only one. As the days turned into weeks, more and more people began to experience the inexplicable. Some reported hearing the faint sound of children crying, their voices carried on the wind that swept across the lake. Others claimed to have seen the silhouettes of a mother and her children standing on the shore, their forms fading into nothingness as they approached. The stories spread like wildfire through the town, fueling the fear and superstition that had already taken root. People began to avoid the lake, especially after dark. The once bustling park grew deserted, the paths overgrown with weeds as nature reclaimed the space. But the spirits were restless. Those brave, or foolish, enough to venture near the lake at night spoke of seeing ghostly lights flickering over the water, as if the souls of the dead were trapped beneath the surface, forever seeking a way out. Some claimed that the water itself had turned cold, unnaturally so, even in the height of summer. As the haunting continued, the town's elders began to speak of the lake in hushed tones, recalling old Hmong legends of restless spirits and the dangers of unresolved grief. They believed that Molly and her children had not found peace in death, that their spirits were bound to the place where they had perished, their souls tormented by the tragedy that had befallen them. Desperate to appease the spirits, the elders performed rituals by the lake, offerings of food and incense, prayers whispered into the night. But the hauntings persisted, as if the spirits were beyond consolation, trapped in a cycle of sorrow and loss that could not be broken. Vadnais Lake, once a place of peace, had become a site of mourning, a reminder of the fragile line between life and death, love and despair. And for those who lived in Maplewood, the memory of that fateful summer would never fade, forever haunted by the cries of lost children and the ghostly figure of a mother who had drowned in her own guilt.